Devils, which is where I was born, and the Tales of Treasure, the Spanish-Main Shipwrecks of Modern-Day Thievery, which is also very closely related to Bermuda, because one of the things I talk about the most is a very famous Bermuda treasure that was found. How did I learn about marine biology? And this was me in 1990, when I was at the Shed Aquarium, and that's our research vessel in the back, which we used to take classes out on, collect fish on, do research on, lots of multiple choices. This is down in the Bahamas. This is what I looked like in 2006, and you can see today's iteration of that. I was born in Bermuda, and lived most of the first 18 years of my life really without going out of the country. I went out for 2 weeks, I think, to see my aunt in New York. And I wanted to be a biologist from the time I was that big. And that little parasitic wasp played a very important role in that. My grandfather was Director of Agriculture and Fisheries in Bermuda, and we used to live with him, and I used to go to the labs around there all the time, and one of the entomologists, the guys, the bugger guys, that, and there's a joke about that, but I won't go into it now, but he used to take care of me, and sort of, as we went out, we'd collect things. There was a big epidemic in Bermuda of a scale insect that was killing off the cedar trees. And they were bringing in parasites to try and find out what might actually attack the cedar scale, and also what were the native things that were there. And he taught me how to culture insects. And one day I came up and I said, Fred, that was his name, "What's this little thing?" And he says, that's a wasp, but I've never seen it here before. And so he helped me pin it, and we sent it off to the Smithsonian. And about 6 weeks later, a letter addressed to me came back and said, this was such and such a wasp, giving me the scientific name, which didn't mean anything to me at 5 years of age, but it's an extension of range, which I did have a concept of. It had never been recorded from Bermuda before. And from that point on, I said, science is a pretty neat thing. First of all, you cooperate with lots of different people, and you find out really interesting things. I want to be a scientist. And so I went on through my life getting this sort of education. I had to put my high school there simply because it's the oldest continuously operating high school in the Western Hemisphere. Started in 1662. And I went to that school. I went to Cornell University, and you'll notice agriculture, not marine biology, but I did get that after Purdue, where I specialized in animal nutrition, dairy cows, by the way, which is a little bit different than pigs and other things. And then I went on to the Bermuda Biological Station, where I wasn't working, but I got a scholarship from one that the Bermuda Biological Station got from National Science Foundation, and that's where I got all my marine biological training. And so that didn't come out. Employment as a marine biologist. I started out after college as curator of the Bermuda Aquarium Museum and Zoo. Then I went on to executive vice president of, at the time, the world's largest aquarium in Chicago, Shed Aquarium. Then I left there, resigned from there, and went on to Duluth, Minnesota to build an entirely freshwater aquarium. At the time, there were absolutely no marine specimens kept there. It was entirely freshwater, the Great Lakes Aquarium in Duluth, Minnesota. And then I retired, and in about 2002, and I went back to teaching. I'd been teaching a little bit before, but I went to Chemeketa, came out here, went to Chemeketa, and taught marine biology there for 6 years, and opened up my own consultancy firm where I was advising on developing new public aquariums and things. So one of the big things I learned was that this was a profession where you could get some adventures and they paid you to have these adventures. So I thought that was pretty neat. So I went from Bermuda to places like the coastal mountains of Lake Baikal and in Siberia, Russia. Spent 2 weeks doing research with the museum, Lake Baikal Museum in Russia. Used to go down to the Bahamas to teach courses and to collect fish. We went to capturing belugas in Churchill, working with the Nature Conservancy and University of Miami to develop a marine park in Dominican Republic. Used to teach in the Everglades in Florida, and was invited by the Canadian government to go up to the Beaufort Sea in the Arctic to tag beluga whales. 2 of those things you're going to see today. Immersion experiences, I think, are the most important thing if you're going to be any sort of scientist. Getting out into the field. And so that's very important to the way I learned marine biology. I also did plenty of reading in marine biology and developed you have to develop a personal framework so that you can put all this knowledge that you're gathering into something that you can recall later. And all of those sorts of things are important to, if you, I know most of you don't want to go back to your, this is something I used to give to the students in Shemeketa, especially for their future careers. But I thought it was kind of an interesting, that's my approach. So I'm still on the journey, still learning, like we said earlier, putting these talks together helps me learn. So that's why I really like it. I've become an Oregon Master Naturalist, and I hope you'll stay with me through this next 2 presentations and enjoy the experience. So now I've got to go and get the other one up.
There's a mouse there too.
Yeah. Belugas, okay. Doesn't seem to want to come up for some reason. Let's see, slideshow. Can't seem to get it to come up. Sorry, Dwayne.
Click on the little icon in the lower right-hand corner.
That's what I did first, yeah.
No, clear over, right? Keep going down. Well,
That's, okay. That's just not to worry about. So the first topic today is the Canaries of the Arctic Sea, the beluga whales. And first of all, we're going to be talking about collecting belugas, basically for display in public aquariums and in the Churchill River, Manitoba, not really in the Arctic, but just short of the Arctic. And then we're going to do one on the electronic tagging of belugas in the Mackenzie River Delta, which is in the Arctic. So first of all, we're going to go to Churchill, and we're going to cover 2 trips in Churchill collecting whales. And then we're going to go to the Mackenzie Delta up in the north, it's Nunavut now, it was the Northwest Territories at the time, and was mainly just entirely Native American little towns and things that you went through. First of all, we're going to, as I said, going to Churchill. Churchill is a little tiny town. Got busy in the summertime for people wanting to see polar bears. And it's at the mouth of the Churchill River. And it's a really interesting experience to go up there. It's right at the sort of southern edge of the tundra biome. And it's right there. So the purple is the tundra. And the tundra biome is most of your biomes are defined by temperature and moisture and other climate factors. So there's not a lot of it around, but it is very wet in the summer and mostly treeless, whereas some of the wetter areas, especially nowadays with the permafrost melting, you get a few trees growing. Really in Churchill you're sort of at the end and you get a few more trees, and there are these flag trees as they call them, and that has to do with the fact that all the part that doesn't have the branches on it and leaves get blown off by the winds and eroded by ice crystals. There's a lot of, the plants are kind of willow scrub and thick growths of specialized sedges, grasses, and a lot of little flowering plants that stay all very low to the ground, mosses and lichens as well. Selection of the things, the prickly saxifrage, the mounds are kind of interesting because that's one of the ways that these plants up there like it. They like to have the little mounds because the inside of the mound stays a little bit warmer in these very cold temperatures. And so that means that they can maintain through themselves through the winter. There's virtually no big trees, but there's a few representatives of the big tree families. That miniature birch gets up to about that big, called a bog birch. And why is that so? Anybody got a guess why there's no big trees? The permafrost. They can't put a root system down for the size of the plant that they're going to get to. So the tree families, the evolution has favored tree families that could make small versions. That's also, whoops, sorry, back. That's also true of the Arctic willow, net vein willow. That never gets above there. And you look at most of our willows, they're at least, most of our willow species around here are at least our height. But there's a whole bunch of different things. This is one of the more sort of dramatic things as you go into a field is this cotton grass, and you get to see it around here, but I've never seen cotton grass in some of the bogs around here. I've never seen cotton grass, whereas as far as you can look are just these white flowers. It's really dramatic. Animals of the Arctic tundra. Polar bears, of course, and we saw our share of it, especially the first time I was up there. Saw maybe, half a dozen to 8 polar bears. And it was one of the years that they really had a polar bear circus. Polar bears just flocking into the area. They have a polar bear jail in Churchill, and that jail had already had about 20 or 30 stalls in it, and they'd already filled it up once, and were getting rid of the second bunch. And this was one that we saw out while we were collecting whales.
How do they get rid of them?
They trap them in a big trap. They put a seal, they go hunting seals. They put a seal in the trap. The trap is a big, well, what you put underneath a road to let the water go underneath the road. So they're 6 feet sort of wide and 6 feet deep. And they get in there, and when they take the seal, it triggers the door goes down, and then the vet comes in and gives them a tranquilizer, and then they pull it out, put it on a truck, and cart it off to the jail. If they turn up, I think it's the third time they turn up in the jail, they get anesthetized.
Why they go to jail is because they're getting into trash? Or
Yeah, they're getting into trash and they're threatening people in the town.
How far away did they take them from the jail?
Sorry?
How far away did they take them from the jail then when they take them out?
They put them on a helicopter and usually far, far away into the wilderness somewhere. I don't know the distance, but tens to maybe 100 miles away. And they turn up again once in a while, you know. And while I was there, we had a rather interesting, we went to the movies at night, which is a very big thing in Churchill. It was not a very good movie, but we were told to be there early because everybody in Churchill would be at that movie. We got there, and the theater was empty. We said, oh, we got here at plenty of time. And then the theater just stayed empty. And eventually somebody came out in front of the theater and said, we're going to be starting 15 minutes late tonight because there's a polar bear wandering up and down the street. And until the mounted police can take care of him and get him into jail, we can't let the crowd in. So they're nasty. The year before, somebody had their arm ripped off in a tourist who tried to pet one out of one of their big buggies that they have that take people on tours out into the...
So you have stupid people up there too?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Tourists, David.
Tourists, yeah. One of the other interesting things, the Arctic tern, very aggressive. I got bombed constantly by the Arctic terns up there because you were near their nest. They were nesting in the land around there. They're interesting because they have the longest migration flight of any of the birds in the world. They go from the Arctic to the Antarctic and back again and back again. So I can't remember, I think it's over 4,000 miles per flight that they normally take. And they found also they don't do it straight. They sort of wiggle back and forth. They go out to the ocean to get a little food to get them the next couple of 100 miles. And then, of course, the Arctic foxes, which turn white when the snow comes. And the interesting little wood frog. Now, who would think that a wood frog would live up there where it's so cold? They actually freeze, and they have an adaptation that helps them freeze. They have glycol in their bloodstream, where they produce it when it starts to get cold, and that stops ice crystals forming in the blood. So then they will go till they don't need it anymore and slowly melt. Their blood will thin again, and they come out and off they take in the spring. It's a fantastic little adaptation. Of course, a lot of the fish that live up there have the same sort of thing. The Arctic cod has the same sort of thing in her blood. Willow ptarmigan. Interesting simply because I think it's a beautiful bird, but it also has protected legs, so the feathers go all the way down to the feet. You can't really see it in that picture. And they also have this wonderful behavior. A lot of predators up there. Big birds, animals, things like that. And when the predator comes near them, in fact, at one point I nearly stepped on several. They just hunker down. They look just like the rest of the tundra. And you can walk almost to the top of them, as I said. So they have interesting adaptations to life up there, and not being made a meal of, except if you're a human, they're delicious. And then snowy owls, another one of the big predators up there that actually once in a while came down. This was taken in Chicago because they come down when there's not a lot of food up there. In the summertime, there's not a big supply of voles and things like that, and lemmings, so they come down to Chicago and Duluth and places like that and feed on the rats and mice, basically the mice that they can find along the shorelines of Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. So this is Cape Mary, and you'll notice that lots of little ponds and things out there. That's the Hudson Bay in the background, and this is the furthest point out into Hudson Bay of Churchill. And they have their own little thing called a fairy shrimp. And a lot of these pools are only temporary. They disappear during the summer, evaporation. And they're also usually fairly salty. And these little fairy shrimp are able to deal with that and reproduce by producing eggs that become cysts. And so when things become unfavorable, they reproduce, lay these little cyst eggs, And they stay there until it warms up enough to get a little water, and they're off on their way. Again, that's an adaptation. They get going before anything else is going. So they have some sort of protection from the other predators that you might find. So in the Arctic, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the three whales. The bowhead, of course, is the one that everybody thinks of as whales in the Arctic. This was the one that was hunted in the North Pacific and in up off of Newfoundland and places like that. This was the big whale. It was one they liked because it had so much blubber in it, they could get a lot of oil out of it. And it had, to the whalemen, it was just an easy, they were slow, so they could harpoon it really easily. They have the baleen in there. They feed on small fish and krill. They skim the top of the surface for that. And the big head there is used to break through the ice. They can go underneath the ice, and as long as it's not too thick, the edges of the ice, they can come up and break the ice and come up to get the air they need. The other big one is the narwhal. And the narwhal is the typical marine unicorn, and probably that's where the land unicorn came from. That's a big tooth, or several teeth. It actually goes through the left front teeth, and it goes through the lip. And they twist around each other and become this big tooth. And for many years, until last year in fact, they really didn't know what those were. They would see them sparring, so it was a mating thing. They would see them sort of using it as to get stuff out of the way, sort of swiping it aside at the surface. Last year, they found out that those don't have any enamel on them. And unlike the rest of the teeth, they have enamel. These don't have enamel. So their senses, you know how it is when you don't have any enamel, you get to feel a lot of things? Well, that's what they think they could do, is that they could, now that they were used for sensing their environment. And they probably could sense food with it, and also might have increased their ability to receive the echolocation signals that they make. And then this year, somebody in the BBC, got pictures of them actually spearing Arctic cod with them.
Oh, wow.
So it's a multi-use tool in nature. And then there's the beluga, which is what we're going to be talking about. And he is really, they're just characters. They're just lovable. Everybody loves the belugas. And in Western Hudson Bay, we were after the Western Hudson Bay population. We'd go up to Churchill, and that is a very healthy population. It's one of 7 Canadian populations. Estimated size of the population is 57,300, or 35% of the world's population. It is considered a Canadian population of special concern because so many of them live between, in shipping lanes, and also in places where there's hydroelectric development. And you'd say, well, why worry about that's on rivers and stuff like that? Well, you'll see why rivers are so important to them in a few minutes. You don't think of whales going up rivers, but this is one that does. Traditionally, they were hunted by the native Inuit for the skin or blubber, known as muktuk. And early in the 1900s to the mid-1960s, and that's what the bag represents there, is the whale was ground up for food for the fur industry and the mink farms in northern Canada. And that actually ended in the 60s because the factory burned down in Churchill. And more recently, they've been collected for public aquariums for display purposes. And I always think that it's better if at least you have live whales and you're learning from them than hunting them for food for mink. I do go along with the fact for mudtuck as food for the Indians, and that they should be allowed to hunt them, because that's how they got the vitamin C. The skin has vitamin C in it, and the Canadian government, in its great wisdom in the 30s, said no more hunting whales, beluga whales. We're going to change you to a lot easier to catch fish. And they did, and all of a sudden, all the people that depended on this mudtuck started getting rickets.
Scurvy?
I mean scurvy. Sorry, wrong, scurvy. Started getting scurvy. And so they went back to allowing them to have a small hunt for the mudtuck. Catching these guys and not injuring them was quite a concern at the beginning. And this guy here, Francis, he was an Inuit, and he developed the method to catch these whales live and without injuring them. And when you go up to Churchill, you see these whales they go up the rivers in hundreds and thousands. And my wife will say this too. Sometimes in parts of the river, you can't see any river. There's so many of these whales going up at one time. They're kind of interesting in their body characteristics because they have no dorsal fin. That just gets in the way when you've got to work around ice. And they have a flexible neck. The neck vertebrae fuse so they can turn around. And they have this bulbous forehead up here, the melon. And that allows them to make facial expressions. And these two features make them very appealing ambassadors for their species in public audiences. Other things about them is that they have this thick blubber layer, which helps insulate them from the Arctic temperatures. And here's the whole thing about the Arctic people's diet again. And it's served raw or pickled. I've tried mudtuck. It doesn't taste very good. In fact, the pickled stuff, I was burping it for 3 or 4 weeks, I think. The maturity is 7 to 9 year olds for the males and 4 to 7 year olds for the females. They mate in the spring, and their gestation is about 14 to 15 months. The interesting thing is that when they're born, the little guy there on the right, they're gray in color and about 5 feet in length. And they don't develop the white color till they're about 9 years of age in the males and 7 years of age in the females. The calves nurse for 12 to 18 months and can nurse an additional year if need be. And we were targeting young ones, juveniles that were 1 to 2 years of age and had attained a length of 6.5 to 7.5 feet. These were the things that were given to us by the Canadian Department of Fish and Agriculture. They are very opportunistic feeders with a very diverse diet, from boreal shrimp to Arctic cod to Arctic char to sand lances, capelin, all of those, Greenland turbot, they all became part of the diet. So, you know, I said hydroelectrics, they're worried about hydroelectrics and why that's important. I already told you how many are in those rivers when around Churchill going up. This is a group moving up river right here. And scientists have asked the question, why do we think they go upriver. A lot of people just said they were feeding, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Favorable temperature for maintaining young, that's probably one thing. The orcas and other predators don't follow them upstream, so the young are sort of protected. And the big thing that we found out in our trip up to the further parts when we were doing blood chemistry and stuff is that the freshwater triggers skin casts. We cast our skin all the time. Belugas do it once a year. And the fresh water triggers the skin to come off. And it comes off in sheets. And the rocks on the river act as a good scratching pool. So here's a pair in the shallower parts of, not a pair, but an adult female and a gray young of the year in the shallower parts of Churchill River. And those adults, they will be between 8.5 and 14.8 feet long, 8 inches long. And they're a small population. The ones we were dealing with up in the Arctic were 17, 18 feet long. So 3 to 4 feet bigger than these. They weigh up to about 4,200 pounds. And the average lifespan of these guys is about 15 years in the wild. The occasional one might last to 40 to 50 years. So now we're going on our way to capture one of these belugas, how we would capture it for putting it on display. This is a live collection chase boat with a driver. The middle guy is what we call the fluke guy, and the one in the bow is the guy that is the lead catcher. They separate out a suggested one that they think is about the suggested size size that the Ontario government says it has to be. They do that by working the boats and also by using oars in the water to make noise. And they work them into the shallow waters. And then the bowman gets ready. You can see the quarry right here. That's a young beluga. And the fluke man prepares himself to jump in. Both of them jump in. And then the bowman dives in next to the whale with this very soft lasso. And if he's successful, he's dived in next to the whale, and he slips this lasso over the top, the neck part of the beluga. And then the bowman, the fluke man jumps in and gets them around the fluke at the back. And they try to restrain and quiet the animal. And that really doesn't take too long in most cases. Sometimes we have to get a few more people in to help. And then they just once they're subdued after the first fright, I guess it is, they just quiet down and are easy to handle. We call over the boat that's going to transport them back, and in that boat is the veterinarian who determines the animal's sex, measures its length, and makes sure that it's of the prescribed size, and then performs a cursory medical exam. They then slip
Question?
Sorry, yeah. Oh, sorry.
How do you determine a 40-year-old beluga? Is it tagged so they keep track of it, or how do they determine it?
You mean, that's the size. We know
A
from
40-year-old will be a certain size.
a 4-year-old will be a
40.
Oh, 40. Oh no, most of those records are actually from captive animals. They don't know about them in the wild.
Oh.
But they also do. There's some other way that they do it, and I honestly can't remember now. I'm sorry.
Check their teeth.
That's it, you hit it right on. Yeah, the teeth. They do it by the teeth, yeah. You hit it right on, it just wasn't there. They slip it into this lamb-lined stretcher, sheep's fleece-lined stretcher, and they lift the whale into the transport boat, and if it's approved, that is. And then it's carried from that transport boat up the beach to a big tank that holds them. They may be there for a minimum of 3 to 4 days, usually no more than a week. The water is filtered and comes straight from the Churchill River, so it's pretty chilly. And this is the first time that these whales will get be hand-fed. So that's something they have to get adjusted to for being in captivity. While in the holding tank, they also will have complete medical exams, and in fact, virtually medical exams every day. And they're taking nasal swabs here to look for microbial cultures, which might indicate infections. Transport day, this is 3 to 4 days or up to a week later. The whales are carefully stretchered again. And because it's a long trip to the airport in Churchill, they cover them with lanolin and zinc oxide, both as an emollient, and the zinc oxide acts as sunscreen. And then the animals are covered with a cold, wet bed sheet to help keep the animal cool for its half-hour trip. The whale is then lowered into the waterproof transport tray, and then it gets put onto a airplane. This is a charter airplane. And you'll notice the guy sitting up there on the top in this tenuous sort of position. That's done deliberately, because these guys down here don't always understand what they're dealing with. And it's best to have a human up on top where he knows he's got a human to worry about up there rather than just a whale that he can't see that's in the box.
Is the whale tranquilized?
No, you cannot tranquilize marine mammals because they have, I know I'm going to get this wrong, voluntary breathing, so that if you tranquilize them, they just shut down and die. So you can't tranquilize, that's virtually true, although they're working now, they've got some that they can partially ease them into that, but not a full tranquilizer. When they're put in there, they're strapped in. This is inside the cabin of the plane, and they're packed in ice because they like to be cold. There's an ice maker on the plane, and throughout the flight they go and get ice and keep these animals very, very, very cool. And they also, there's a vet goes with them, and he's constantly checking all their vitals to make sure they're doing well. Then they arrive back at the place like the Oceanarium in Chicago, where they do beluga behavioral demonstrations. And this is where things have changed in my institution, or what used to be my institution there. When we went, we did what I call a behavioral demonstration, not jumping through hoops and things like that, because I wanted people to understand what their behaviors were in the wild. And yes, they were trained, we trained them to do their normal wild behaviors when asked for in the tanks. And this tank, by the way, is 2 million gallons of water. At the time, it was the biggest tank ever built for whales. So we do these normal behaviors, including the behaviors we have to teach them to cooperate with a veterinarian. Now they have what I call a theater show, which to me is not, it doesn't do anything for the animals or for the humans. It's only for entertainment. And they don't learn, nobody learns anything. And so I'm very distraught by this change in tenure. If you want to see more, I can get that later for you if you want to really look at more beluga whales in the wild. So now we're going to go to the second part of this that I'm going to have to pick up a little bit. Tags, electronic tags for the beluga whales to enable satellite tracking. And one of the things I want to point, this was by the Fisheries Department in Canada. We were invited to go, but you should understand that much of what we know about whales in the wild and in captivity is because aquariums have undertaken quite a bit of expense. SeaWorld, places like that, gets dumped on all the time. We wouldn't know anything about either belugas or killer whales if there weren't SeaWorld. They paid for a tremendous amount of research. I'll come to you in just a minute. Penguins also. SeaWorld did a tremendous amount of research on penguins to get the big emperor penguins and things like that so that they could keep them. And virtually everything we know about penguins comes from that research.
Do belugas acclimate to warmer climates, such as SeaWorld?
The water is refrigerated.
Okay.
Even in Chicago, we refrigerated the water. So this is collecting in the mouth of the Mackenzie River, where we collected these. It's there for 4 weeks, and we're about 20 miles from the closest town, which is what we used to call Tatwa. We're up there. I can't pronounce the Inuit name for it, so I won't try. Just a little introduction to the area. Here, you're in the true Arctic, and you can see the polygonal patterned land and the pingos. All these things were surface features formed in response to the permafrost and freeze-thaw conditions that happen in these areas in the summertime. And one of the interesting little stories is they don't take refrigerators up there. They take a big pingo or another bank, dig in there with a big ice pick, and make their refrigerators in the permafrost. Just a few other things that were very common up in this part of the Arctic where we were. And this was the whale camp. We were invited to stay with an actual whale hunt camp. And these were all Inuits. And you say, well, they look kind of poor. They have the old-fashioned canvas tents and things like that. I got to learn why they had canvas tents. This is the land of the midnight sun. That kept them dark. So, land of the midnight sun, and things happen at any time. If the kids wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and want to get up and play, they get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and play. And scream and yell, by the way, too. And if whales appear off in the distance, they have a whale spotter, several whale spotting spots. They will go out at 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning to catch the whales. This was at 3 o'clock in the morning. And these were whales that were going to be butchered. And here shows you the whole process. They air dried it, then they put it in big barrels, and off it goes to the various camps and sort of social gatherings that the Inuit had. Quite often the Inuits and the Inuits get dished for their taking whales. Well, they're a lot more concerned about the future of their whales than many of our populations have been on our fishing whales here. Although we talk a lot about it, they do a tremendous amount of biological research on the remains so that they know what their population is doing. This was a different way of collecting them. We would go in a speedboat with a net in it and pay out the net around when we located a group. we'd go around and get them, and then we had people on the standby, and when we got them, we would jump overboard because they would drown if they hit the net and couldn't be pulled up. So we'd jump overboard and go up underneath the net to push them up to the surface so they could breathe. Then we'd attach the tags. This is the tag right here, and you'll say that's kind of gross looking, and maybe to some, because they put it through with big plastic nylon bolt, not plastic, but nylon bolts. And they drill it through the back, but it doesn't matter because it's in that big 6-inch thick layer of blubber. And there's no nerve endings in that blubber, and no blood in that blubber. So it was pretty harmless. They didn't even flinch when we did it. And then there's a guy ready there to, one of the other researchers, to let go the one that had just been tagged.
How long does a battery last?
About 6 months. These were very primitive ones. These were some of the earliest electronic tags. This was 1992, I think. And the electronic tags weren't very advanced in that. Mosquitoes.
When you release them, is there any fear of them turning around and going after the man there?
They're very gentle animals. They really are. They're the sort of thing that they do is that they may roll on somebody or something like that. And I've seen that happen in Churchill when they rolled over and hit somebody with their flute accidentally.
Yeah, just remember.
Yeah. Mosquitoes, always with you.
Oh,
Everywhere you went, there were mosquitoes by great bulk. Just everywhere, swarms. The tracking tag is attached, and while they're doing that, other vets are taking blood and giving the whale a medical, and then another vet would give a prophylactic antibiotic, broad-spectrum antibiotic, and then the whale was sent on its way. We would take the blood back to a field lab, our own creation here, and we would do some of the blood analysis ourselves and prepare or fix other samples to be sent back to our various institutions.
I assume the netting was to ward off the mosquitoes?
Yeah. So during this time we tagged 17 whales, and they varied in size. We wanted to get this cross section in ages and sizes, 7 to 17 feet in length. The tag, when the whale was at the surface, would send off a message up to a satellite. The satellite would then collect it and then broadcast it to our relative institutions. And this is a feed out of what the ones we tagged. This was sent down to us just before we left. And found out some pretty startling things. Like, we always thought, everybody thought, there was general knowledge that that belugas never went down more than about 100 meters in depth. That was their depth, their deepest dive. This, we found out, they went down to about 800 meters.
Wow.
And probably for feeding purposes. We don't know exactly why. So it was a really interesting experience to be up here working with Canadian scientists and our own scientists and things like that, get this information. So then that's the time to pretty back up and fly out and return to civilization. I should mention one thing. You may, Carolyn, recognize this. I got an attack of salmonella while I was up there. Barb had that too. And the closest they had to actually fly me into the medical place in TAT, 20 miles away. They had to call in a helicopter and send me there for The nurse there straightened me out, but. So that's my conclusion. Thanks for listening, and I'll take any questions. Any more questions? Yeah.
How intelligent are they compared to, say, orca and other dolphins or other whales?
You know, it's really hard to say. I think they're pretty intelligent. But it's really, that's a really hard question. I mean, they did things that made you think they were very intelligent. They could mimic. They would actually, in the shed, they would mimic like whistles from the other, from the trainers, and then get the dolphins that were in the pool doing the dolphin behaviors, and you could be, it was almost certain that they were enjoying watching the dolphins.
Right, a sense of humor.
So I think they're pretty intelligent, and you know, I really couldn't give you a definitive answer on that.
What's the budget for an organization like this to do this work?
You mean for my aquarium, for instance?
Well, to do all the research and things. What kind of money does it take to support this?
Probably per trip, $250,000 to $300,000. That would be in sort of the late 90s dollars. Yeah.
How did you determine how deep they dive? You talked about 800 meters, what?
The electronic tag on it had sensors. And while it took some physiological parameters that they could do, one of the things we did was depth that they were diving. And so when they came to the surface, you knew how deep they'd gone down.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I noticed early on that the Latin name was Delphins something. They're not part of-
Delphinius.
Yeah, they're not part of the dolphin family, are they?
Yes, they are.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They're a toothed whale, just like the dolphins. Different group. I mean, you know, if you had a tree, the branch would come off, but they would all be in the same group. So they're related to orcas and to dolphins. And any other questions? Okay, we're going to go from the cold to the somewhat warm. It's actually one that doesn't ever get as cold, but you'll be surprised how some waters that in the Galapagos can be quite cold when you dip your toe in. So, this is from a trip I did in 1988. Well, let's just go. I won't. So, first of all, that's right. There's a sort of a debate on where the island's name comes from. It's sort of one of those debates that really doesn't deserve a debate, because really it's the guy that the Spanish priest nicknamed it after the giant tortoise whose shell reminded him of a saddle. The other side of that is the students of archaic Spanish say that Galapagos was the word for tortoise, and because there were so many tortoises there, it was called Galapagos, meaning island of tortoises. So it's, yeah, you know, is it a debate or isn't it? So another common name from that is the Saddleback Islands. And then our friend Herman Melville had published another name for it, the Encantadas, meaning enchanted islands. And even he says that he didn't really think of the Galapagos as being really truly enchanted islands, because they were dry and strange animals and lots of cactuses and things like that, and huge spiders. But he also thought they were kind of magical, and that he got from sailors who called them the Enchanted Islands, and that's where he got the name from, because if you've been there, this is a place where the currents swirl around and they're very strong. I mean, in my trip, one day, we were meant to get to a place within an hour or two on the boat, and it took us all day. And it was because we were fighting currents. And also they always have lots of mists and things around it, so the islands would disappear and reappear and things like that. And so that, we think, is where Melville got his name, the Encantadas, or Enchanted Islands. Where are we going? These are the different places that I went to. The major stops are red ones, the blue are sort of minor stops. These are pretty much the ones that everybody goes to, although maybe they don't do them all in one trip. I did all mine, luckily enough, in one trip, because we had a bigger sort of allowance. In that one of the co-leaders had a friend who ran the trips, ran a boat that ran trips. So they're part of the Ecuador, about 600, 700 miles off the coast of Ecuador from Guayaquil, due east of Guayaquil, and has really interesting geology. This is because it's a meeting of two plates pulling apart, and you have this ridge, this Cocos Ridge up here, going here, and there's a spreading that is occurring here, and you also have a hot spot underneath of it, which is a geological phenomenon where there's magma that actually bulges up and comes up close to the surface, and so every once in a while it breaks through the surface. Hawaii is the example of a true hot spot set of islands. This one here, the Galapagos, are a mix of magma that comes from the ridge, the big spreading ridge there, and also from a hot spot that's underneath of it. And so you actually, from one side, from the west side to the east side islands, you can find magmas or rocks now that have different chemistry because they have different origins. And it's a very tricky thing to talk about this, so I'd rather just not try to explain it all. As I said, they're hot spots, and that's where they're formed on the edge of the Nakaza plate. That plate is moving apart from the other plate by about 3/4 of an inch a year. So that's just to give you an idea. And hot spot, really, we'll just concentrate on the hot spot, because what it is the magma is close to the surface, it comes up, forms a volcano, and the plate keeps on moving, and so eventually that plate, that island that was formed is further along, and then there's a weakness in the top of the plate again, and the magma bubbles to the surface, and you get the second island, and the third island, and the fourth island. So that's how a hotspot island chain forms. And just remember, though, that this is actually a mix of two, the hotspot plus the ridge formation. So the ages of the islands, to help support that, is that if you look at this, you get the direction of the Nakaza plate. You see that the islands down here are older, and in fact many of them are now are thought to be extinct volcanoes. I don't think they're ever going to react anymore. The younger ones are up, are up here at the top of the screen. And the other interesting thing about all of this is that thought is gone, I'm sorry. But this is interesting, and that's why I got caught off guard here a little bit, because I pulled this one up. The volcanoes are really, really interesting, and people don't think about being caught out there in a boat. And this guy here, Captain Morel, in 1825, was caught next to that eruption, February eruption of Fernandina Island. This one, the picture is 2009, but he was caught there in 1825 when a similar sort of thing happened. And he was a scientist, while he was a captain, ship's captain, he was a scientist, sort of self-taught, but he started taking temperatures. The air temperature outside of the boat was 147 degrees
Oh, my God.
Fahrenheit. It was so hot, the tar was melting off the ropes from the rigging, and the pitch, which sealed the boat from the water getting in, started to melt out of the ship's seams. That's how hot, and he couldn't do anything about it because there was absolutely no wind, and this was in the age of sail ships. There was no wind. And after 2 days of putting up with that, and keeping 24-hour watches going so they could bail out the boat and everything like that, they got a little wind, and he said, "We're going for it." And he did, and he made it. And but he had to pass within 1 mile of the shoreline as he got out from where he was. He was near Buccaneer Cove, and Fernandina is just about 2-3 miles away from there, and it comes in a little bit. So he was about 1 mile from the shoreline of this thing. The water temperature was 140 degrees centigrade at that 1 mile thing, and it was only marginally hotter than the air. So that's pretty, and to record this, I think this is in my reading, this is one of the most exciting things I read. I was waiting for a volcano when I got there. Never got to see one, but anyway. So if you look at the Galapagos geology story, there's visual evidence for this all over the place. This is a big crater. This is Volcan Alcedo and Isabella, which, by the way, Isabella is made up of 5 volcanoes that sort of met together to form this big island. This is the biggest island in the group. And then there's, in Isabella again, we quite often used to see the fumaroles when we went to the very top. We hiked up to the very top. It took us a day to get to the top. And then there's the small lava tubes here. This is in Sombrero Chino. Many of you may have been on Santa Cruz and hiked through the big, half-mile long, 10, 12-foot high lava tube at the top of Santa Cruz. And now it's lighted. I was reading the other day, it's not, there's just lights down there because I guess they have too many injuries. But we were told to turn off our lights by our guide, and you are immediately completely disoriented. You have no idea what's up, what's down. It's so black in there, you can't believe it. So anyway, that's where the lava tubes are the cooled outsides of the lava flows from the crater coming down. There's all sorts of other evidence. The Junco in San Cristobal, Lake Junco, is a flooded crater. Pinnacle Rock is the remains of a tuff cone in Bartolome. There's little spatter cones on several islands, best developed on Bartolome, and that's where as the volcano is erupting, you get a very gaseous type of magma, and it forces itself up along the sides of the cone to produce these little mini volcanoes on the side. And you get the different types of larvae, the Pahoe and the Ah. Everybody said the Ah got its name because when you walked on it, you said Ah. It's in a very dry area anyway, as far as wind systems to bring waves, water, and the landscape certainly doesn't encourage water, so it's really quite dry, even from the very beginning. The Spanish bishop that we talked about in the naming of the island, these islands were worthless and barren because there was no water. And to this day, water is pretty minimal there, and places like Puerto Arroyo and Santa Cruz, they go to collect their water, a lot of people go to collect their water in milk cans like that for their day's use from a local source. And to this day, reliable potable water supplies are a critical concern for the people that live in many of the human population centers on the island. Even with reverse osmosis and things like that, there is a place in Santa Cruz now where they're using reverse osmosis, but it's so expensive that most people that live there can't afford to take advantage of that. So, a little bit about the human history. This guy here, he is not Robinson Crusoe. This guy here, he's this guy who you may have heard about, Woodes Rogers. He went on to he was a famous privateer. Does everybody know what a privateer is?
Pirate.
Well, not exactly.
Sort of.
They were legal pirates, let's put it that way. He was a very famous British privateer, and he was rewarded by the governorship of the Bahamas later on. His big job when he got there was to wipe out the pirates in the Bahamas. But anyway, he had discovered Andrew Selkirk, aka Robinson Crusoe, and some islands off of the coast of Chile, and brought him to the Galapagos, where he then got a boat back to the real world, and then he was written about. Whoops. So it also was the home for a lot of whalers during the 1800s, late 1700s and 1800s. This is just an example of, I wanted to make sure you understood that people on ships, they had a lot of spare time. They worked hard when they had to work, but they had a lot of spare time. And so scrimshaw, a lot of them became scrimshanders and produced scrimshaw and whale's teeth and things like that. And those are now, the real pieces are considered really important folk art and very expensive. Colonization, I'm going to whip through this because I really wanted to just show you that this is a pretty barren place. And things did not really work out for a lot of the ideas that people had. And the first resident went crazy and stole a ship to get away from it after growing vegetables for trade for the sailing ships. It lasted about 4 years. And then in 1832, Ecuador annexed the Galapagos. They set up a settlement there which failed, exporting lichens for dye and tortoise exports, and also agricultural produce. And another one was set up and failed in the 1858s. Lichen harvest and tortoise oil exports. Then in the 1893s to 1960s, another attempt to colonize Floriana was abandoned and moved to Isabella. They were exporting sulfur, lime, tortoise meat, and oil, and salt for salting fish. Then in the 1960s, Norwegians and Germans, some to avoid Hitler's policies, colonized Floriana and San Cristobal. They were involved in self-sufficiency, mainly, and were farming and fishing. Oops, the wrong thing. And with this group, there was some intrigue, there was murder, scandals. Some of these the ladies would run around nude, and there were all sorts of scandals. Getting into trouble. Somebody was going to kill somebody, and they'd run up to this lady that shows in the picture here, and we'll talk about her in a minute. There actually were a couple of murders that remain unresolved to this day. In fact, this lady was as part of the story in some of these murders. That she was accused in some cases. And she was one of the very, very successful. Of all those attempts in Floriana, she and her husband and a couple of other people later on managed to live there and survive there. She died in not too many years ago, in the early 2000s. When I saw her in '88, she was 84 years of age, and their family were making this orange wine here. It was very good. That provided them with a lot of the money for living because they had to get some things like flour and things like that they had to get from offshore, from boats passing and things like that. So that's how they made their cash, by selling that to tourists later on. She was a neat old lady. And just, if you haven't, and you want to read a really intriguing and sort of book on the Galapagos and trying to survive the wildest parts of the Galapagos, I encourage you to read that, because she writes a fantastic book. It now can be obtained in English. It wasn't for a long while. You couldn't get it. It was in German. Because she was German, by the way. She and her husband. She lost a son to the sea. His son went out one day and didn't return. Her older son, the younger son, was also very helpful with the farm and everything, but had health problems. So he wasn't. I mean, this was a real loss for them. And they were getting older, and the son disappeared. And there are some other important visitors, mainly scientists. And this is probably the most important. Charles Darwin. You probably all know that his observations during his trip in 1835 came out in The Origin of the Species, which was published in 1859. And one of his biggest things was the concept of adaptive radiation, where new species were created as they went to new islands and faced different pressures, and survival of the fittest meant that, in this case with the finches, they developed different types of beaks to help feed the things that were make them better feeders of the things that were available. And these are just two pictures that I saw of the medium ground finch and the warbler finch. The next one I wanted to highlight was William Beebe in 1925. He was the Jacques Cousteau of his time, but he didn't have you all know who Jacques Cousteau is, right? He didn't have TV at his call. He wrote books, and some of his books, these two included, are wonderful. He was a wonderful writer, very flowery. Today's English teachers would probably knock him for his flowery language, but he was a wonderful writer, recording facts and observations that became very controversial in many cases. And also, because he tried to bring science to the public, he was not very well liked by the real scientists. He was not considered a real scientist. He was the curator of birds at New York Zoological Society. So he was quite a character. I mean, he made it difficult for himself because of his character. But I think he's one of my heroes as a naturalist. The other guy I put in because I knew people around here would know, Gifford Pinchot. who is, his forest is nearby here, it was named after. He brought in, before he went here, he was the chief of the Forest Service appointed by Teddy Roosevelt, and he brought in the first sort of scientific management of forests. He was quite a scientist. I mean, he was a well-respected scientist. And he also was a conservationist, and he coined the word which everybody uses now, conservation ethic, as a term in management of natural resources. He had, in his group, when he came here, he had a filmmaker, and they made a very long documentary about the Galapagos and his ventures through the South Seas as well. But he went and played it out throughout the entire United States. And so it sort of really spread the word of the Galapagos. So he was a really important scientist of the time to bring this sort of knowledge that we had at the time of the Galapagos and the South Seas. All of this history of science produced an ecotourism program and a bunch of conservation efforts. And ecotourism, is it a cursing or a blessing? Positives, they increase, this whole park system has increased the dollars for islanders. And it has really provided the tourist with better knowledge of the Galapagos environment and how fragile it is and how special it is. But there are a lot of different negatives. There's a lot more development that has occurred in the island to support this ecotourism. They've had to bring a lot more people in, which again is a problem when you're living on a very small island, that don't have a lot of natural resources already. And they stress the wildlife, all of these people stress the wildlife. So ecotourism can be a blessing, but it also, if it's not managed properly, can be a big problem. So in 1959, Ecuador called the Galapagos its national park, its first national park. It was accepting visitors by 1970. In 1959, you also had the Charles Darwin Foundation, which established a research station there, for conservation. And any of you have been to the Galapagos, you probably have been to the research station. That's one of the standard stops. And these two agencies share the management responsibility for the park. In '78, it became the Galapagos became a World Heritage Site, or the park did, and a biosphere reserve in 1985. So it's quite well documented ways of trying to support this area. So what makes Galapagos so special to scientists, especially to biologists? It's its unique positioning in Earth's surface. It's isolated, and it has both a terrestrial and a marine environment. And the climate is subtropical, regulated by the Humboldt currents, which are the bottom two blue things come up. They're cold. And the warm El Nino, which is an offshoot of the countercurrent and equatorial current, and then you can see the small red area, the El Nino coming in, bringing in warm water. You also have this Cromwell current, which is really cold, and that's the reason that we have one type of bird there that doesn't go any further north than that. Penguins. And so the climate is based on a warm, wet season, which is December to June, and a cool, dry season, or guar, which is June to December. You can see from the average rainfall, 8 inches of rain a year. Not a lot of rain for people to live in. really sort of just about desert conditions. So the thing is that what really intrigues the biologists is all of the speciation that has occurred there, being endemic species. And how did the original things get there that made these species or evolved into new species? And really it's a rafting on ocean currents or being flown in by birds, or in some cases insects, things like that. And rafting is the way that most of the animal life got there. Birds brought in seeds and things like that for most of the plant life. And but when you arrive, it really is an all-out battle of the survival of the fittest. When you get there, the conditions are abominable. And these slides here these images try to illustrate that. There's not a lot of things that can go on there. Water everywhere, but ne'er drop to drink. And I refer to the ocean around there, but there you need fresh water. The vegetation, because of the winds and everything, the bigger islands especially are pretty well zoned by the different types of plant groups that have survived. You have the Pampa zone, the top one, which are tree ferns and things like that. Then you have the Myconia zone, which is an endemic plant, now not very common anymore. I should go back, they also have a lot of lichens and mosses and things like that, and bromeliads that live in the Pampa zone. And that's where you get just about all year round in these bigger islands, you get a amount of moisture, just like our rainforests here on our coast depend in the summertime on condensation. This, you get the same sort of thing here with a lot of condensation supporting the upper Pampa zone. You have a brown zone, which is mainly mosses and lichens attached to trees. Then you have a very special zone, Sclesia. Oops. The Sclesia zone is very special because Sclesia is a daisy, and it is the only tree daisy. So this is really kind of an important zone. And then you have the transition zone where you have a lot of the cactuses, or your giant fungi, the tree cactuses, and the arid zone where you have the lava cactus, which is another endemic, and the coastal zone, which is kind of a little bit more because these are special plants that live with the salt water, mangroves being one of them. So now we're just going to show a quick sort of tell and show, I guess, of the different types of the zones and what the plants are in those zones. We start out with some of the classics, like the arid and transition zone. That's where you find the giant candelabra cactus. That's this guy right here. And then the giant tree prickly pear. And of course, there's a thing about the prickly pear evolution with the tortoise. They think that the reason that some of the tortoises have evolved that saddle with a big neck, hump in the neck, is that they can reach up higher to get up to the pluntia pads to eat them. And as they've gotten up higher to do that, they have ones that grew taller, and the other ones all got eaten up, and the tortoise then tried to get higher to get to those, and the ones that got bigger humps got to go up higher, and so that's the battle of evolution that's going on there. That's one of the theories anyway. These are the Sclesia. I really don't, my picture that I have of the Scledia isn't really very good, but they get to 12, 14 feet in height, and they're trees, and they have the compound daisy-like leaf. Flower. And then we have the Myconia. This is an endemic. You find in the Pampa zone also, and the Galapagos tree fern. All of these, there's about 600 plants that are native to the Galapagos. In other words, they got there themselves. And some of them have evolved, about 30% of those have evolved into endemic species found nowhere else in the world. And then we have another 800 species of plants that were brought in and by man, and about of those 800, many of them useful to man, there's about 100 of those 800 that are creating real problems now as invasives that are taking out. The Myconia zone is pretty much devastated by the quinine tree that was imported in 1947, and it forms a canopy in that zone. It likes that zone, forms a canopy over there, killing off all of the Myconia. The fur seals, they're everywhere. My biggest thing about and why I put the fur seal in was I swam with fur seals, and they are the most curious things you want. They came right up to my mask and touched my mask, looking in to see what was inside the mask. And they were just fun. I wouldn't do that with one of the sea lions there, but the fur seals were just lots of fun. Of course, the population now isn't too bad because fur seal hunting is finished, but fur seal hunting pretty much decimated them. They thought they were extinct, in fact, in the 1920s, when they found a small population, and the one today has grown back pretty much. But now they're worried about dogs and things like that that are being introduced in the islands and let go wild. In the coastal shallow waters, we have things like white-tipped sharks, mustard rays, golden sheephead, and bacalo. Bacalo is grouper. These were the things that we caught when we went on a fishing trip with our captain, and they're all good eating fish. Nowadays, they think a lot of these are really in trouble. They don't know yet because fishing has sort of gotten out of hand and is not being managed very well at all. And then we have the beach collection of marine invertebrates all over the place. You can find these. The coral is a Poecilopora, which is one of the common corals of the Pacific. Southern Pacific, I should say, yeah. Intertidal beach, moving up from the shore, we have the Galapagos sea lion, or beachmaster, which is the insert. And the beachmaster is really, they get up to close to 1,000 pounds, whereas the females are about 200 to 300 pounds, somewhere in that range. And of course, they fight. Beachmaster versus beachmaster is their fight. They keep harems, and they fight to maintain a harem, and the ownership of the harem turns over about every month. So that's and the harem can be usually from 5 animals to close to 30 animals. So they're kind of interesting animals. And if you go there or have been there, you will find, if you've been on the beach, they're very aggressive towards humans. And you have to really watch yourself. The beach there I wanted to point out because it's this red rosy beach. That isn't my coloration of the slide or the image or anything. That's iron in the beach, and there's a couple of places, a couple of islands that have very iron-rich beaches like that. The crab, the fiddler crab down there is very small crab. Gets his name because his small hand, he fiddles across the big hand, which is waving, and waving is a way to attract mates. Those little balls there are his feeding pellets.
Or what?
Feeding pellets. They take sand, they take it in their mouths, down in their burrows, and they work it around, cleaning off little bits of food that are dissolved, or not dissolved, but included in the sand. And then when they've got all the food out, they take it up and put it next to their burrow. You will also find some bigger pellets, although I don't have a picture of it there. And there, when the tide comes, I mean, the tide goes out and they're not active, and they want to protect themselves, they will move the ball in there to protect themselves, block up their burrow. Green turtle. These are the tracks going up on the beach for a female going to lay them. They lay about 100 eggs, well, anywhere from 50 to 200 eggs. That's on a purpose, on nature's purpose. They work together to get out of being buried down about 3 meters, about a meter. And so they work together by flipping around their flippers and crawling on top of each other. They finally work, when they hatch, they work their way to the surface. And these are 2 hatchlings at the surface. And of course, that's when life gets exciting, because just about any predator in the world feeds on them. And the gulls feed on them, and the groupers feed on them, and the frigate birds feed on them. And we actually watched one of these, and the bird life just became enormous. I mean, we got most of our sightings at that hatchling because everything came to feed on them. Then there's the rocky intertidal with the marine iguana, and the marine iguana is a cold-blooded animal, and so it manages to get itself warm by laying against the rocks. And as the day goes on and he gets warm enough, you'll see their behavior changes, and they will push themselves off the rocks because they're warm enough. And they do this especially after they've been feeding. They feed on the algae that lives down in the subtidal zone, and they scrape the algae off with these teeth here. Not so sharp as they look like. They act like a rake as they rake through the algae that's growing on the bottom. There are different forms or subspecies, you might say, I guess, or from different islands. These are the Fernandina population. This is the Hood Island population with a reddish hair. And the other thing that they have is that they're the only iguana that we know of that is marine. And they will actually have special ways of getting the salt out of their blood that they're in all the time, and they sneeze it out. And you get up to a colony of these things, and there's sneezing all over the colony, this way and that way and everything. And even though it's so common, very hard to take photographs of. But they're really neat animals.
David, may I add that they don't get out of the way.
No, they don't.
Okay, you have to step over them.
Yes, that's right, that's right.
And they're ugly as sin.
Then rocky intertidal animals, the Sally Lightfoot crab, which is darting in and out all over the place, got its name in the Caribbean because Sally Lightfoot was a dancer that danced all over the, and that's how they got their name apparently. I mean, that's what the literature tells you. Then you have the, the lava heron over there who's fishing on the Sally Lightfoot. That's just a color morph, we think, of the greenback heron, the little greenback heron that we have around here. Maybe a subspecies again. Intertidal sea anemones and his murex snails produce a bright purple dye, which was, another species of it lives in the Mediterranean, and it was used by the Phoenicians and bought by the Roman Catholic Church almost exclusively to dye the Pope's robes. Another one from the rocky intertidal is the flightless Galapagos cormorant. this is a typical thing that happens to island birds. Once they get there, they lose the power to flight because there's enough food there, and they don't really need to get to other places. So they do that type of behavior, or over time they evolve this loss of flight patterns, but they're still very strong swimmers, and they feed on the bottom, and they don't have any way of drying their wings off. So when they come to the surface, this is pretty typical of their stance, because they're holding their wings out to dry. Some other coastal birds, the brown pelican, of course the penguins, the only penguin group that is found that far north, sometimes actually into the northern hemisphere, just by a few miles. There's a couple of populations that switch over. Yeah.
We were at a place where there were fishermen had brought in their haul and they were cleaning the fish. Pelicans everywhere.
Yeah.
And you practically had to say, move over, buddy.
Yeah. Yeah, pelicans will do that, yeah. So the pelicans are another one there. That's in breeding color there with a dark brown back. The penguins, as I said, this is the place where they get into their the most northerly populations of them. I actually went swimming with the penguins, and they were chasing food bait and everything around. It was grand. Swallowtail gulls, I put that one in because they're one of the more attractive gulls, and actually they're also very special species. In that they only feed at night. Most of the gulls feed during the daytime, and they think that's to avoid predation. The waved albatross, the goony bird, fun to watch. You go to Hood Island and they actually fall off the cliff. They're terrible flyers, and they waddle up. I mean, they're terrible flyers at the beginning, I should say. They waddle up to the cliff. They can't walk very well either on land. So they get up to the cliff, they fall, and then halfway down the cliff they start clapping away. They're really fun to watch. Of course, the frigate bird is noticed because of the gular pouch there, the male. The gular pouch of the male. And the red-footed booby. Booby is a old Spanish word meaning clown. So that's again because of the way they walk. And then we have the blue-footed booby, who likes to show his feet off in his dance, his bending dance. And he throws his wings up, and he goes like this. And blue is really important because it shows healthy. Bird is healthy. That's why he shows them off. And he'll end it by bending down and picking up a stone or a rock or a piece of branch or something like that and giving it to the female. And hopefully she'll accept it. So boobies are really, really fun birds to get there and watch. And it is a survival of the fittest, because if you don't have blue feet, you're not going to find anybody to go to bed with that night. And it's really stunning. Well, the final part is when they've accepted one another, is the bill sparring up there that you see on the right. They really like to go down and dive, and that's very spectacular, especially when you get 40 or 50 of them together, all diving into the water together. And you see them go down and hit the water together. Up in the arid and transition zones, you have things like the Fernandina snake, which again I put in because he will actually, has been recorded, the only snake that's been recorded to fish in tidal pools around the coast. And he's kind of interesting for that. There's a lot of lizard. The land iguana, which is huge and also eats the pads, spines and all, of the prickly pear. And the spider I put in there because the spiders have a unique way of getting to the islands. They put balloons out, and the balloons are silk. I mean, they might put 3, 4, 5 silk strands out that probably that long, And the wind catches them and they get into the winds and they end up on an island like that. And then they carry on there. And I should say that, you know, insects at the beginning are not real common on an island. And so many of the plants that you see on an island don't have a very colorful flowers because they don't have to attract insects. In fact, the earliest plants, most of them on an island, are wind pollinated. Then you might get ones with white flowers, not really big white flowers or anything like that, just white flowers because white is a common attractant. They bees and things like that get over there see white, it becomes ultraviolet to them. And so, and then you start getting, once you got a developed flora, mature flora, then you start getting your more colorful flowers that you associate with the tropics. And then you get the giant tortoises up. We found our population up at the top of Volcan Alcedo. That's that one down there. And there's different islands that again have different populations. And they're basically vegetarian. And then you have a bunch of these other birds and things that go from the shoreline up to the top. The one that's probably the most interesting to you would be the Galapagos hawk right here. It is an endemic, and it's really quite majestic when you get to see them. This guy here, the mockingbird, along with several of the finches, will quite often be seen feeding on that land iguana I saw earlier on. They have a sort of a mutual agreement with each other that he will stand up, and the mockingbirds and the finches will come along and feed on the insects, the ticks and things that live on the iguana, the land iguana. And then, of course, there's all the invasives. These are two of the worst ones, the blackberry, which is like us, and it really outcompetes the scalesia, the daisy tree, and invasive guava, which is brought into for the fruit for humans. But a lot of the animals benefit from it because it is a very high energy food. So, but they're considered undesirable in the park. And then, of course, there's all sorts of invasive species that are animals like the donkeys and the goats and the horses. And it's a constant battle, and it's very, very expensive. When you get down to the last few and you got hunters out, they'll say, you know, everybody says, why don't you just get rid of them? And you can't put poisons out because you don't want to impact the other animals, and it ends up usually in a hunting situation. And the last couple of animals are really hard to exterminate. Even good trackers have a hard time. And per animal, your cost goes from $25 an animal to $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 an animal to exterminate it. So it's a very expensive business. If you want to help the Galapagos in any way, this is a US-based organization that will take your money willingly. But the last point I want to make is that the Galapagos is really are the biologist's Rosetta Stone. It's to the biologists that need to understand the concepts of evolution, and that has become the key to solving most of the biological problems in the world and ecological problems. So or I shouldn't say problems, because they're just questions. So, thanks for listening.